Defense.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Members of the jury, this is my opportunity to tell you what evidence I believe will be presented to you during this trial. This is not an opportunity for me to make argument or to rebut what the state has said. I will have that time, but that is not now. So right now, Mark Sievers' wife is dead, and he wants to know why. Just like everyone else. The only why is coming from one person. And that one person is Curtis Wayne Wright. And so what I'm about to tell you is a narrative that I have constructed from the evidence. Curtis Wayne Wright has been a longtime friend of Mark Sievers. They grew up both in Missouri. They met in high school. Curtis, over the years, would get into computers. And in that he was good with computers, he would eventually perform some of the computer maintenance at Dr. Teresa Sievers' medical practice. Curtis has access to the Sievers medical computers remotely through something called a VPN, or a virtual private network, so he can do this job and access their information from Missouri. Curtis is getting married on May 3rd, 2015 in Missouri, and Mark is invited to attend the wedding. Mark goes, he comes back. There are some, as you'll see, there are some texts between Curtis and between Mark. There have been texts between Curtis and Mark for years. Sometime in June, Curtis decides to go to Florida. He doesn't hide this. He texts people, "I'm going to Florida." Curtis receives a check from Teresa's medical practice for $600, which is customary for the IT work that he performs. And I anticipate that you will see other checks also for the IT that are similar in amount and similar in how often he gets them to this one. Curtis takes his friend, Jimmy Ray Rodgers, with him. There is not going to be much, if any, evidence that Jimmy and Mark know each other. They may have exchanged pleasantries at Curtis's wedding, but that was ultimately the extent of that relationship. So Curtis and Jimmy get to Bonita Springs, Florida at approximately 6 a.m. on June 28th of 2015. Mark and his family are in New York and Connecticut celebrating Teresa's mother, Marianne Groves. It's her birthday. Teresa leaves before the rest of her family because she is the doctor at her medical practice, and she is the only doctor. Accordingly, she is the only person who is capable of seeing patients and administering their medical care. Teresa gets on a plane and goes home. Teresa arrives back in Bonita Springs late on June 28th, 2015. This is where my narrative, the narrative, becomes unreliable. Jimmy and Curtis go to Jarvis to quickly view the Sievers home in the morning. Curtis had been to the Sievers home in several other times where he acquired the garage and alarm code of 1313, which is a mnemonic device derived from the old sitcom The Munsters. The Munsters' address was 1313 Mockingbird Lane, or Mockingbird Way, I'm not sure which, but they let themselves in, they're in the house, then they leave, at which point they go to Walmart to buy souvenirs. Curtis then says after they go to Walmart, they go to Teresa's medical practice to view it as a possible potential spot for the murder. Curtis will tell you he remembers the office code because when he had been there, it was a mnemonic device called the Fibonacci sequence, which is a mathematical equation where you continue to add the sum of the two numbers to the next number, and the following number gets larger and larger. They go to the beach. They have a beer. And finally, they go back to the Sievers home after dark. They park in an apartment complex approximately a quarter-mile away. Curtis will say that they each put on a jumpsuit, they put on latex or some type of gloves, and that they tape the wrists and ankles with duct tape. They make a pry mark on the side door of the home to make it look like a burglary. Curtis will then say that Teresa surprised them when she came home. Curtis will say that he is in the garage and he is checking out Mark's motorcycle when the garage door starts to lift. Curtis panics, and as Teresa walks into the home, Curtis follows. Curtis picks up a hammer, and he's intending to perform, it's a submission move, it's called a rear naked choke. He kicks over a dog bowl. The sound alerts Teresa, who turns around. Curtis swings that hammer. Bang! Right in the side of the head. Followed by another one across the bridge of the nose, leaving a crescent-shaped gash. Strikes her one more time before he says his shoulder is bothering him. He got tired. At which point, Curtis is going to say that Jimmy Ray Rodgers also had a hammer and began swinging wildly, ultimately killing Teresa. You anticipate Curtis is going to say at that point, they panic and they leave. Curtis drops his hammer on the floor, leaves the house. I anticipate you're going to see that hammer. I anticipate you're going to see photos of that hammer. A hammer with Teresa's hair entwined on it, with her blood on it. On the way back, Curtis says he disposes of his jumpsuit, which was stuffed in a backpack. For whatever reason, Jimmy does not. They leave the house, they take nothing, and they drive back to Missouri. And later, I'm going to tell you a little bit more just about why the narrative that I have told you is unreliable. Mark gets a call from the medical office on Monday morning. Where's Teresa? Mark knows that a friend of the family, Dr. Mark Petritus, has a home and an office within 2 miles and can get there the fastest. He also calls his mother, Bonnie, but Dr. Petritus arrives first. Mark is concerned because he has a app that shows what percentage of battery power is left on Teresa's cell phone. The battery is very low, and the cell phone, according to his phone's ability to geolocate, shows that that phone is still at home. Dr. Petrides arrives, finds Teresa lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and calls 911. Paramedics arrive, declare Dr. Teresa Sievers dead. Detective Downs and Levitt follow up on a tip that leads them first to Illinois, then to Missouri. On July 12th, 2015, Detective interviews Curtis Wayne Wright twice. Both times, Curtis denies leaving Missouri. Detective Levitt advances a theory that Mark Sievers masterminded the murder with the intent to collect life insurance policy. On August 27th, Detective Levitt interviews Curtis again, who denies any involvement. Detective Levitt advances a theory that Teresa is leaving Mark in that interview, and he is fixated on whether or not Curtis is bisexual and has a sexual relationship with Mr. Sievers. On October 15th, 2015, Curtis Wayne is booked into the Lee County, Florida jail. Curtis's attorneys are furnished with discovery, including the narrative from the Lee County Sheriff's Office, a narrative that includes such details as life insurance as a motive, infidelity as a motive, and staging or fabricating the crime scene. On January 6th, 2016, Curtis gives an initial videoed proffer. And on that video, Curtis says to Detective Levitt, Detective Downs, Mr. Hunter, and Ms. Ross, and both of his lawyers, that he was not even present in the home when the murder occurred. The detectives say, "We don't believe you." Right then, Curtis says, "Everything I said, everything I told you about the trip, up until we got to the parking lot of the apartment complex, is true." But then he says, "Yes, I was in the house, but I was in a different room and didn't participate." Once again, Lee County Sheriff's Office said that is not good enough. So on attempt number 3, Curtis says, "I struck Teresa 3 times in the head with a hammer. But Jimmy did the rest." Fast forward to February 19th, 2016. Over a month later, having an additional month to prepare, Curtis agrees to the following, a proffer agreement. Curtis agrees to testify truthfully. Curtis agrees to fully cooperate, giving testimony. Curtis agrees to fully cooperate in locating additional evidence. He agrees to submit to a polygraph or a lie detector test. He agrees that failure of memory is not a reason to excuse him from the contract he signed with the state. Having now had 4 months to prepare, Curtis gives the narrative that you're very likely to hear today. And that narrative conforms to Detective Levitt's theories going back to July 12th, 2015, from the first time he was interviewed. You're going to hear about prepaid phones. You're going to hear about divorce, infidelity, life insurance as a motive. But ultimately, all the evidence of a conspiracy, all the evidence of Mr. Sievers' involvement is going to come from one man. And that's Curtis Wayne Wright. You're going to hear from several witnesses. I'm not going to go over all the witnesses, but I do want to address a few witnesses. One, you're going to hear from Dr. Mark Petritus. Dr. Petritus will testify that he maintained a friendly, personal, and professional relationship with Dr. Teresa Sievers. He will testify that on June 29th, 2015, Mark Sievers called him and asked him to go to their home after Teresa did not show up to work. Dr. Petritus will say that he discovered Teresa's body, called Mark and asked him to come home immediately. Dr. Petritus will say that he gave two initial statements to the police on June 29, 2015. Dr. Petritus was then sworn in under oath and deposed on October 10, 2017. 2 days after that deposition, Dr. Petritus reached back out with additional information to the Lee County Sheriff's Office, information that he had not shared up to that point. Another deposition was conducted in February of 2018. And Dr. Petritus will then tell you it was not until September of this year that he withheld, finally came forward with some of his most damning statements. Statements that cannot be corroborated by any other witnesses. Statements didn't even come out during the trial of Mr. Rodgers. You're going to hear from crime scene tech Kimberly Van Was. She was a lead crime scene examiner. She's going to tell you that she went to the Sievers home on Jarvis to take measurements, collect evidence, take photos, develop latent fingerprints. She will say there was a pool of blood around Dr. Teresa Sievers, but there was no cast-off. And we'll get into what cast-off evidence is. She's also going to offer evidence about the alarm. She's going to offer evidence that Curtis attempted to clean up after the murder. You will hear from Detective Levitt. He'll say that he interviewed Curtis and Mark. And Detective Levitt developed a theory early on and then had the good fortune to find witnesses and evidence that corroborated his theory. As mentioned earlier, Detective Levitt was the investigator who came up with the theory of life insurance as motive. He'll say that Curtis was resistant initially, but eventually came around to agreeing with that and just about every other theory advanced by Detective Levitt. You may hear from Taylor Showmaker, who is Jimmy Ray Rodgers' girlfriend from Missouri, mother to his child. Taylor was interviewed on August 25th, 2015. She was able to lead Detective Downs to a jumpsuit. There's a video, actually, that's going to show how Ms. Showmaker and Detective Downs came upon the video and the state that it, or came upon the jumpsuit, as well as some latex gloves and how they were laying when when they were discovered. And that is to say, the jumpsuit in the video, and the gloves were found in a small pile by the side of the road. Taylor was interviewed again on August 28, 2015. And you're going to hear, one, Taylor doesn't remember very much at all about what happened. You're also going to hear that the Lee County Sheriff's Office has paid her approximately $20,000 at this point to be a witness in this case. You'll hear from Detective Michael Downs. Detective Downs went to Missouri with Detective Levitt. Detective Downs, with the assistance of Taylor Showmaker, made a video recording the moment when Taylor found the jumpsuit. Detective Downs informed Ms. Showmaker that she could go to jail or face charges, but instead, he was able to come to an agreement by which he convinced the Lee County Sheriff's Office to pay her, again, approximately $20,000 for her testimony. Detective Downs also used Mark's close friend, Carrie Kane, to gather recorded evidence on a prepaid phone to use against Mark. Detective Downs ultimately concluded in writing that Carrie Kane offered nothing of evidentiary value. You will hear from Carrie Kane, I believe you will, who tried everything she could to gather evidence against Mr. Sievers. Ultimately, however, all she was able to gather were opinions and assumptions. You believe you'll hear from Nick Schuneman, a Missouri police officer who supervised Detectives Levitt and Downs while in Missouri. Officer Schuneman was responsible for doing the actual collection of all the evidence and serving the warrants while in Missouri. You're going to hear from Dr. Thomas Coyne, who is the medical examiner here in Lee County, Florida. Dr. Coyne performed the autopsy, and we anticipate that Dr. Coyne will testify that Dr. Teresa Sievers died from repeated strikes from a hammer. And of course, you're going to hear from Curtis Wayne Wright. He's going to tell you that his testimony was in exchange for an advantageous plea deal. Curtis will tell you that he tricked and manipulated 4 of his neighbors into providing a false affidavit to establish an alibi. And we'll talk to you about how he got those people, how he tricked them into giving those false affidavits. Curtis Wayne Wright will tell you that Mark Sievers agreed to pay him between $100,000 to $150,000 from the life insurance policy, but was only actually paid $600 from a check that was consistent with the other checks he got from doing IT work, and $300 for Curtis to install a surveillance system in Mr. Sievers' home after the murder had occurred. He'll tell you he was told to make the murder look like a burglary, but nothing was taken, including the approximately $50,000 in cash that was in the home. He'll tell you that he lied on several occasions, but was never administered a polygraph to determine what, if any, of his statements were truthful to any degree of scientific certainty. The state will probably not show you the videos of Curtis's prior testimony where he lies.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper argument.
Sustained.
We believe that the state is going to try to offer up witness after witness to try to prove to you that there was turmoil in the Sievers marriage. When in fact, the Sievers marriage is like every marriage where there's children. There were highs and lows, ups and downs, peaks and valleys. Mark was primarily responsible for raising their two girls, Josephine and Carmela, or Josie and Carmi as they like to be called. Girls were good homeschooled students who were busy with extracurriculars. And if you believe that as parents, it is our job to prepare our children to become adults, Mr. Sievers was doing just that.
Improper argument.
Move along.
I expect that you'll hear that after menopause, Mark and Teresa had some intimacy issues. And I expect the state will present evidence that Mark and Teresa were on the cusp of bankruptcy, except for the $50,000 in cash that was lying around the house, and the vacations, and the donations to charity, and their comfortable lifestyle.
You know,
Teresa-
objection, Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes, ma'am. Ready. The jury is to disregard any of the comments about bankruptcy. There is going to be no evidence about any bankruptcy.
Thank you, Honor. There is, however, going to be evidence that Teresa Sievers had a busy medical practice, that they were beginning production on a new series of television shows called Pathways to Healing, that they had filmed 2 of 10 episodes and have more planned. We anticipate that you'll hear from Monica Lyons, the Sievers estate planning attorney. She'll tell you that Mark had reciprocal life insurance out on himself, that Teresa was underinsured considering her profession, and she's going to give you some testimony about the age and the history of these insurance policies. Ultimately, it is our position that Teresa Sievers was worth more alive than dead. Ultimately, it is our position that the state is not going to be able to carry its burden of proof. Ultimately, it is our position Mark Sievers did not conspire with Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Ray Rodgers to murder his wife. And Mark Sievers did not murder his wife. And at the end of this trial, I'm going to be asking each and every one of you to return a verdict of not guilty because Mr. Sievers is innocent. Thank you.
Can I have both sides approach for a moment? I want to thank you for your attention here this morning. We have some matters we have to take care of before we go to the first witnesses. We will get to some witnesses today. I'm going to instruct you to still not talk about the case with anybody else. Don't look up any of the people or places involved, and we'll have you come back at 1 o'clock. That'll give you about an hour and a half for lunch. We'll see everybody then. Please be seated. Anything further until 1 o'clock, state. Defense? See everybody then.